Lovely. Please can the webcast be started? I can confirm we're live.
Super. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our informal briefing for the Children and Young People Select Committee. As you've just heard, it's being webcast on YouTube via the County Council's website for openness and transparency. I will start with apologies. Have we had any apologies?
I haven't received any, Chairman.
Any from the floor, so to speak? Everyone very quiet, so I'll take that as no. Item 2 is Chairman's announcements. I'd just like to say a very quick hello and a welcome to all our new members. As you've just heard, it's an informal briefing rather than a formal meeting of the committee. This is just so we can receive important updates whilst observing COVID-related social distancing restrictions. But our first formal meeting of the committee will be in September, and I look forward to meeting you all in person then. But hopefully this will give you a good understanding of what our committee does, what it can do, and the department that it oversees. So with no further ado, we'll go straight into our introduction to Select Committee governance, and I'll be handing over to Nicola Thomas and Jackie Taylor to present.
Thank you, Chairman. I think Jackie might have just left the meeting, but I'm happy to make a start. I just unfortunately don't have the ability to share the slides, which is
okay,
bear with
no
me.
worries. Slight technical hitch.
Yeah. Are you happy to me to speak the slides? You should have them in your packs, hopefully, and hopefully when Jackie joins, we can have a look at those.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. So
Chair,
they are.
If I can just, I probably can. If you give me a few seconds, I'll try and put the screen.
Thanks, Steve.
I mean, I can start. So for those that you don't know me, I'm Nicola Thomas. I'm from the legal department. I work alongside Jackie Taylor, who's from the Democratic and Member Services. And my role is to support the Select Committee. We'll both be presenting the slides through just so you get a brief understanding of what the Scrutiny Committee does and how it functions.
While Steve's trying to work his technical magic, I'll just add that we'll take questions at the end, but if you want to raise your hand during the presentations, I'll try and keep an eye on them and go through you as soon as the presentation is finished.
I'm so sorry, my computer kicked me out.
That's okay, Jackie. Steve's come to your rescue.
Thank you, Steve. So looking at the background to scrutiny, our present arrangements of the current process were introduced in 2000 when we moved to the more familiar arrangements of a leader and cabinet model. Most of you will be familiar with this arrangement, and it operates across most of the country. So there's a legal requirement to have at least one scrutiny committee, and in Hampshire we call these select committees, and we've chosen to have 5. These cover the different thematic areas, broadly covering Hampshire's service department areas, and the committee are appointed on a proportionate basis, so are cross-party and representative of the political balance within the council. These committees are appointed on this committee meets 4 times a year, and the membership does not include that of the executive member, as the fundamental role is to hold the executive to account. So the role and purpose of the scrutiny is an important function of scrutiny to hold the executive and council to account. You have broad powers to make recommendations to the executive or to the county council arising from the processes it goes through. You also have a broad advisory role in relation to the functions of the County Council and matters affecting the children and young persons in Hampshire. So for this, you're able to conduct research and analysis of policy issues and the possible options. And you can do this by the establishment of working groups which run alongside officers' work to influence work and making recommendations to the Executive and County Council in development of the budget and policy framework. Next slide, if you don't mind. So your terms of reference are set out in detail for those of you who want to look them up, are in Part 2, Chapter 5 of the Constitution, and that's available on ModGov. In terms of your executive member, this particular committee relates mainly to the executive member of Children's Services, but it does also cover part of the portfolio of the executive member for performance, human resource and partnerships, as their portfolio also covers the Supporting Families programme. Your key department is Children's Services, but the remit isn't limited just to this department, but the whole council in considering the specific remits which are set out here, which are reviewing the needs and interests of the children and young people to ensure they're met by all departments, policy, service and decisions, and how performance is evaluated and improved. And this can include universal, targeted and specialist services for children and young people, prevention and management of risk, social care and children's and young people well-being, education supporting and enabling for all children and young people, internal and external partnerships working in regards to children and young people, and supporting parents and families and the relevant financial management. Next slide, please. So what does scrutiny do? In Hampshire County Council, we operate in a slightly unusual way in operating our scrutiny function, as we have chosen to hold executive member decisions in public, and that requires us to publish reports 5 clear days in advance. As a consequence, it makes it possible for Select Committee to pre-scrutinise executive member decisions, and in this way the executive member who tends to sit on Select Committee meetings is able to take into account your recommendation and observations before making the decision. This is therefore very much more proactive and collaborative than a system that requires Select Committee to use the power of call-in in order to have your recommendations taken into account. And the County Council considers that process allows the Select Committee to better influence policy development, which hopefully leads to better decisions. In addition, it doesn't remove the power to utilise the use a call-in, which is when the committee can scrutinise decisions that have been made by the executive member before they are implemented, and that's known as call-in. And you are also able to scrutinise decisions after they have been implemented, either shortly afterwards or as part of the long-term review of the effect of a policy. We've also detailed on this that when dealing with the education function of the executive, we include membership of the co-optees, which is the one Church of England diocese, a Roman Catholic diocese representative, and there are 3 parent governor representatives. Albeit there is no requirement for those to be filled. So committees potentially receive a report ahead of the decision making and are being asked to consider the proposed recommendations and the basis on which they are being proposed, and to make any recommendations as a result of the report. So a number of issues that the Select Committee may wish to consider, which are set out here, which when looking at reports, and it's looking at, are the decisions being evidence-based? Has appropriate consultation been undertaken? Do decisions reflect the County Council's priorities? And have alternative options been considered? Next slide, please. So looking at the process of call-in, this can be used where Select Committee considers it necessary where a decision has been made to scrutinise further before the decision is implemented. So in effect, this has to be done very quickly and can only be done within 5 working days of the date the members have been notified of the decision. The committee would then need to meet within 14 days of the meeting being called, and this is all prescribed in legislation, which is quite specific. Next slide, please. So the call-in options, the committee must decide whether or not to recommend that the decision is being reconsidered by the relevant decision maker, or that where a decision is not in line with the policy or budget framework, that the county council should take that decision. Next slide, please. The effect of that call-in is that any decision that is not in line with the policy or budget framework cannot be implemented until the call-in has been disposed of. Urgent key decisions, which, to give you some context, is when you're spending or saving over £1 million, or potentially having a significant impact on more than one community. Those can't be called in, although they can still be scrutinised by the committee, because, as we referred to earlier, Select Committee can consider any decisions the executive has made after they've been implemented to consider the long and short-term effect. I think that's the end of my presentation, Jackie, if you're still available.
Yes, thank you. I am. Thank you. So this slide, policy development and review. So each Select Committee is also able to review and make recommendations to the Executive or the County Council on matters within their remit, which will assist in the development of future policies and strategies. Sometimes items are referred to as Select Committee by the County Council or by an executive member, or sometimes the Select Committee may decide for itself an area that they feel needs some further review. And areas of review can consider the following. Do we have a clear and up-to-date approach? Is it the right approach? Are policies coherent and joined up? And whether the policies are effective when put into action, essentially, is what we're doing work in. Next slide, please, Steve. Thank you. So this slide details a bit more information about working groups. So a way that the Select Committee can occasionally work is through the establishment of a working group. And this involves a small number of committee members, normally 4 or 5, and it's cross-party to reflect the membership of the committee, and focuses on a topic the Select Committee feels would benefit review. So the working group would effectively give additional capacity to do that. In terms of establishing a working group, the Select Committee would need to agree terms of reference for it, and also aims and objectives to ensure that it does have a set task and finish approach and can conclude appropriately. Thank you, Steve. And this slide gives some more information about items for the agenda. So any member of the committee can request an item on the agenda for the next convenient meeting of the committee. And to assist with this, the work programme is reviewed at every meeting of the committee, but suggestions can also be made to the chairman and myself in between meetings. Any member of the County Council can also refer a matter to the relevant Select Committee if they feel this would benefit from the Select Committee scrutinising it. And as mentioned earlier, either an individual executive member or cabinet collectively, or the County Council can request that the Select Committee consider a matter referred by them. And just to give an example, this has occasionally happened when deputations have been made to a County Council meeting, and then the County Council have asked the relevant Select Committee to take a further look into that particular issue. Next slide, please, Steve. Thank you. So topic suggestions, again, suggestions for the work programme are welcome at any time. So please feel free to email either the chairman or myself if you think of anything that might benefit from the Select Committee looking into this further. There is the option to put items also on the member briefing programme, and this is held monthly if you feel an information item would be of interest to all members outside of the Select Committee. And this enables all members of the County Council to be briefed that way. Next slide, please, Steve. Thank you. So again, the agenda formation, there's a rolling work programme, which, as I mentioned before, is reviewed at every Select Committee meeting, and the work programme normally covers the next 3 or 4 meetings, so members can look ahead and see what's coming up. Thank you. Next slide, please, Steve. Right, what will success look like? So successful scrutiny is member-led and member-driven, has a work programme that's flexible and achievable with topics appropriately prioritised according to what you as members want to achieve from it. Any reviews it conducts are well scoped and project managed to ensure they are timely and focused. And the time and resources of the Select Committee are directed where it can add most value in order that everything is constructive and evidence-based. Thank you, Steve. And the final slide, in conclusion, the role of scrutiny is much wider than the core legislative ability to hold the executive to account, which in some cases is seen as the calling function. But in actual fact, calling historically in Hampshire has rarely featured because of successful pre-scrutiny and Select Committee engagement in the decision-making process. And scrutiny provides an opportunity for constructive cross-party member engagement and input through effective dialogue with the executive and the department to contribute to policy setting and decision making. Thank you, Steve. Thank you for stepping in at short notice. We're happy to take questions.
Thank you, Nicola and Jackie. I think I saw Jackie Porter had a question. So we'll start with Councillor Porter.
Yes, please. Nicola made some very good points. Thank you, Nicola. And one of the points you made was that it's actually this committee is looking at not only the work of children's services, but also the impact of policies right across the council on children. And this has been something that I've been raising because we have to justify our own request to see confidential papers for other select committees or other decisions, and we have to justify those very clearly before we're able to see them. But actually, from what you're saying, that is a valid request in any case as a member of this committee. Would you like to comment on that from a governance point of view?
It would be difficult to know without knowing what the confidential papers were, but yes, you do. It's not just, you're quite right, you're not just limited to the role of children's services. It's about how other departments are contributing. And we set out, I think it was in slide 3, around you're reviewing how all departments meet the needs of children and young people within the Hampshire area. So there is definitely a crossover of our function, the Select Committee.
Thank you. That. I think that clarity is really helpful because we've always said that actually, and I'm a spokesperson for Children for the Lib Dems, so we've always said that we read through, certainly I read through every sort of potential decision by every department and expect to look at the implication of that for children as far as I'm able, as to my team. And so therefore we do need to be conscious of that as a committee, and to perhaps look at looking at the forward plan of other committees as well, so that we can look at that implication for the implication of this our own Select Committee. I don't know. The other one that you didn't mention was public health. At the moment, health decisions generally go to HOSC, but actually we have raised health issues, like for instance CAMS, comes to this committee, and I wondered if that is fully explained in the Constitution. I can't look at it while we're actually doing this meeting at the same time. But.
So public health decisions are made by the executive member for public health, which is why HASC would be the scrutiny committee in which it filters into. It's because they're leading on the scrutinising the decision making of that particular executive member, whereas obviously children and young persons is primarily focused on scrutinising the decision making of the children's services executive member, and we touched on the other human resources performance element of that as well. It doesn't mean to say you can't be briefed around those decisions. It just maybe it's more appropriate for the Health and Social Care Committee to be scrutinising the decisions through that executive function.
I think that's one of the areas where I think there is a a challenge really, because there are occasionally decisions which are made, well, and health visitors and budget cuts and all sorts of things, where actually the impact on children is something that needs to be looked at. So I just would like some clarity on that for the future, and for Councillor North that's chairing this committee. How does that work for the future?
Well, I think we're broadly in agreement on that, Councillor Porter. It's something I've been raising myself, and I'm keen that our members are at least aware of the decisions which do have an impact, particularly on the children and young people 0 to 19, whether they come through this committee formally or not. And it's certainly something that I'm pushing, shall we say.
Thank you. Well, that's really encouraging, Councillor North, because I think it's certainly something we all need to be very conscious of. Too many people will, otherwise those sort of things will just slip through. Thank you very much. That's really helpful.
No problem. Councillor Neville Penman, our Vice Chairman.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. Going back to policy development and review, and it comes up change in law. Does that happen often with new laws that are coming in?
Laws change frequently, and it's my duty, my team's duty, to try and ensure that everyone remains up to date with that, and that the council's policy and procedures are kept in line with those.
Thank you very much.
I haven't got any more hands on my screen, but if you would like to ask a question, could you unmute and do so now, please?
I was just going to say, actually, Chairman, if I may, that I know questions might crop up as well from time to time, or in the forthcoming months or over time. So more than happy, myself and Nicola, to take any questions sort of outside of the meeting if members do think of anything after the meeting has happened.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jackie. OK, well, thank you to you and to Nicola for that. We will move on to item 4, which is the introduction to Select Committee Children's Services Department, and we will go straight over to Steve, please. Steve Cocker, our Director.
Thank you very much, Chair. So I'm really conscious that today we're going to be imparting lots of information, lots of presentations, and for new members, I think I'm sure you want to be reassured it's not always like that. But we've done this now, and I've obviously been around for a long time, and we've done this over many cycles, many electoral cycles, to give members of the Select Committee an introduction to the range of services. And the feedback we've had over the years is that it's been really helpful, not always immediately, but as you go through the next 4 years, this gives you a reference point to come back to, and to sort of a benchmark, say, oh yes, we talked about that, and I've got a certain level of understanding on that, but I'd like to now dive in a bit deeper on an issue. So what you're about to hear will go much deeper than any of the previous all member briefings. This starts to get right into the real issues of the services. And I'm going to kick it off. And the other sort of byproduct of this is that you'll get to meet all of the assistant directors who are responsible for the relevant service areas, and you can put names to faces and so forth. What we'll do as we go through, there are various sort of natural pauses as we go through. So I'll do an introductory bit. I'll pause, see if there's any questions. I'll then hand over to Stuart, who's going to talk through children's social care. He'll do his bit and he'll pause for any questions, and so on. So we anticipate it'll probably take about an hour and a half to get through this, but we'll go at hopefully the right pace and allow for questions. And I hope it is a fruitful exercise in terms of building up your knowledge, and also for members that have been on the committee before. I hope it serves as a good reminder, and also it'll describe things that have moved on even in the last few months. So just bear with me a second while I get the presentation up, and then we'll crack on. There we go. Oops, I've gone. Here we go. Okay, so just to double check, that's on everybody's screen, hopefully, and you can see that. I can see somebody nodding, so that's great.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. And there you go. That's the aim of this briefing, is to give you a baseline level, introduce the team, and we're going to cover the three main pillars, if you like, of children's services: keeping children safe, improving education attainment, and access and planning for the future. And outline on the way, outline some of the achievements and the future challenges. And the last section doesn't shy away from the challenges. Just to give you some background information with regards to Hampshire, you may well already know this, but just in case you don't, about 305,000 children and young people under the age of 18 live in Hampshire. Just as an aside, a child is defined as a young person under the age of 18. It's about 21% of our total population, about 12%, and probably, and this is census data, and all of our intelligence around the pandemic tells us that this figure's increased, but around 12% of the local authorities' children are defined as living in poverty. And in free school meals, you can see primary schools is 15%, and in secondary schools 13%, below the national average. But of course, because we're a big county, you start to look at 15% of 305,000. It's quite a big number. And English as an additional language is in primary schools 8% and secondary 5%. You can see significantly below the national average and reflecting our demography. Around 10% of children and young people in Hampshire come from Black and minority ethnic and traveller heritage, with about 4% included as having English as an additional language overall. So there is a significant Nepalese community in Aldershot, as people may know, and Polish communities in Basingstoke. And Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities are often present in a number of districts in Hampshire. The number of young people aged 0 to 15 is forecast to increase by 3% by 2025. That's housing developments and so forth. I think that's probably a reasonably conservative estimate, and that's mainly about inward migration in terms of people moving into Hampshire from other parts of the country, because the number of babies being born has slightly decreased. So that's the background. A bit about children's services now, and probably the first thing to state is that children's services is a highly regulated and inspected area of local government activity, or indeed public service activity. Most of that inspection is done by Ofsted, but there are various regulations and laws that we must comply with. At the last count, I think there are 226 statutory duties that I must deliver. So doing those statutory duties well occupies a lot of time and energy, but it's hardly ever noticed, frankly, because it's just what we have to do. That external verification, that external inspection is a burden. There's no two ways about it, but it also is helpful in terms of its verification that you're doing things well. People who are broadly respected in the field come and say, yes, that's going well, or that isn't going so well. And sometimes you have to learn and do things differently. It applies to all aspects of our services in children, child protection, children care, fostering residential, but also school improvement and so forth. And of course, all schools are regulated and inspected, and we've got that performance, that check and balance all the way through our system. Yeah, okay. And that's what the inspection outcomes look like. Mostly of those in terms of children's social care. I'll come on to the education bit in a minute, but there's a long history of good performance in relation to the quality of services that we deliver. Overall, our performance places it in the top 5% of local authorities. And I'm bound to say that we're in the bottom 5% in terms of spend. So really interesting stuff there. The thing that I would say, and that in fact, and in fairness, Ofsted say as well, is yes, we're outstanding. We're really proud of the fact that we did well in that inspection. Outstanding does not mean perfect. Nobody, no authority, no service is perfect. We continue to strive to be better, to do things better. And we look at when we make mistakes, and we will make mistakes, we try to learn from them and put things right. As an indication of the levels of activity, I did a back of a fag packet, although I don't smoke, but a back of a fag packet calculation that said that in the course of a year, we probably have in the region of 1 million personal interactions between a professional and a member of a family, whether it's a child or an adult, about 1 million. So nobody's going to get 1 million personal interactions right. But we need to understand where it is, if there's anything systemic that we're getting wrong, and if there is, put it right. But we will always make mistakes, and we'll always try to find out how we can put things right when we do. In terms of budgets, there've been, as members will know, there's been significant savings programs since 2010 and the financial crash. Significant reinvestment by Hampshire County Council in terms of its children's services. So those overall savings has been, part of those savings has been the need to invest in the pressure with regards to the pressures around the cost of children in care. We'll come back to that in due course in this presentation. Our overall budget is around 238 million, but relatively small percentage of that is in the staffing budget. Most of that goes on the costs of care, including independent fostering agent care placements, independent residential placements, but also our own foster carers and our own residential homes. So it's about the cost of care is the most significant area, though there are other areas of significant external spend. For example, homeschool transport is about 30 million quid every year, and we have no choice in that. It's defined in law. We will have more budget challenges to come, and I'll return to that in a bit more detail. I'm really confident, most importantly, that we've got the best team, I would say the best team in the country, to meet these challenges and to deliver the services that we want to deliver at the highest quality that we can. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to one of those members of that team, but just pause for a second. That was just an introduction, really, and I'm going to take the presentation down for a sec, just to see if there's any questions from that introduction before we go on to the next layer of detail, which will come from Stuart in terms of children and families. I'm not seeing anything, so I'm going to... I'm okay to press on.
So you go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. So I'll now hand over to. I'll put the presentation back up. There we go. And I'm going to hand over to Stuart. And because I can't see anything, I'm hoping he's there because I can't see anything.
Yes.
Right. Okay, Stuart. Over to you.
The presentation hasn't come up yet, Steve.
Okay, that's interesting.
We've got it. I've got it, I should say.
It is up, Stuart. I'm not sure what's happening there.
Oh dear.
Right.
Slight technical one. What I'll do then, if you just give me 1 second, I'll have to open it up separately. Obviously, my screen's playing up. If you could just bear with me, members. I have got a copy of it here. And I'm assuming, Steve, you're on the Children and Families branch.
That's it. And I've just moved to Journey of the Child.
Fine. Okay. So good morning. Apologies, members. I can't see the presentation I'm talking to. So I'm Stuart Ashley. I'm Deputy Director. I'm responsible for the Children and Families branch. The Children and Families branch is in the main children's social care, but it's a bit broader than that. And as that slide says, Journey of the Child, what I'm going to do is walk you through from just before the front door to children's social care, right through the service to adoption and residential. And there's a number of different functions within my services that I'll explain as we go along. So next slide, if we could, please, Steve.
Yep.
I see some other members can't see the slides either. Is it worth us taking it down and trying again, Steve?
Yeah, I'll do that. Apologies, bear with me. Okay.
I can see it now.
Okay, I'm just going to come off and I'm going to re-project it. No idea what that happened. Apologies.
I think there's some gremlins around today, Steve.
Yeah. Okay, can somebody give me an indication of whether that's now on screen?
It is, Steve. Yes, thank you. It just needs to go on full screen, as it were.
That's it. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I hope all members can see the slides now. So what's early help? Early help is pre-social care, and we obviously want to assist families at the earliest possible point before needs and risk escalate and more expensive services need to be accessed to keep children safe or to support families. What you would have heard on the news of late, and it's certainly an increasing policy position for the government, is what's known as family hubs. Well, we've actually had family hubs in Hampshire for a number of years. We call them early help hubs, and we have 8 hubs across the county on a district basis. And what happens is a range of multi-agency professionals come together, led by Children's Services, to agree support and interventions to families at an early stage to prevent those needs escalating, as I've said. Next slide, please, Steve. Our hubs came into effect in their current form in 2016-17 when we remodelled the service. We brought together the work of our children's centres, our previous early help workers, our youth support services. And I have to say, we created a really modern, integrated early help stroke family support service. And we do undertake a lot more group work. We use technology in a different way, but the most important thing is that it's multi-agency. It's not just Children's Services. All agencies have a responsibility for supporting vulnerable children and families, and we have a very good and effective model in Hampshire. We work with around about 2,700 children at any one time, preventing their needs in the main escalating to children's social care. And all the different practitioners take responsibility for the delivery of those interventions. Next slide, please. But unfortunately, sometimes early help is ineffective, or when we find out about a family, their needs are already significant or the risks to a child too great. And at that point, Children's Social Care will then need to intervene. And we have one front door in Hampshire known as the Multi-Agency Safeguarding Hub. And we will in due course be sending, or director will be sending an email to all members with contact details if you come across a family that you've got concerns for, child welfare concerns, or you want to be able to advise a member of the public how they can raise concerns. We'll give you the contact details, and it will look something like this with the details you can see on the slide. Next slide, please. So what is a multi-agency safeguarding hub? In short, it is 3 key agencies, so Children's Services, children's social workers in this case, police and health professionals, working co-located in an integrated way, sharing information about families when they come to our attention. Children's Services rightly has the lead. Our responsibility for safeguarding it sits squarely with the local authority. And what the MASH does is they triage the incoming information, they share the information with police, health, and then we reach an agreed decision about whether services are required, whether we need to undertake an assessment, it's a social work assessment, or indeed whether actually we can signpost the family or the professional to other agencies. Next slide, please. And this is a visual representation of it. It looks complicated, but in actual fact, it isn't. What's unique about Hampshire is we have a 2-tiered approach to our MASH, our multi-agency safeguarding hub. Incoming contacts, phone calls, emails, letters, whatever, will go to the children's reception team. So it's a large team, 20 practitioners. They deal with over 120,000 contacts over a course of a year, and they will find out what information they can, and they will screen out about 50% of that incoming contact, whether that's from a professional or whether it's from a member of the public. If there are more concerns that they find out or they think that needs further investigation, they will pass it on to the MASH and they will triage it, quite literally mash the information. And from the MASH, work either gets signposted, it might get signposted back to early help to say actually early help services can deliver this, or it will go on to our social work teams, the CAST team and the DC team, two acronyms I know, but I'll be explaining them in the next couple of slides. But they are in essence social work teams. So that's how work comes into children's services and goes out again. Next slide, please. And then at the top of here, you can see the actual partners in the MASH. So health, police, adult services, and the CYP triage on the left-hand side is actually notifications from the police of any incident they attend in which a child may be present. We also then have a range of virtual partners, and they're really important to us. I won't go through them all, I'll just choose one as an example. So South Central Ambulance Service, they will often attend a family home late at night. They might then think there's concerns around domestic abuse because someone there suffered an injury, or they're concerned about the state of the house when they attend. They will refer that into us, and they're a good source of information around safeguarding children. So all of those partners are essential to safeguarding children. Next slide, please. And then just to give you a little bit of information about the volume of work that will come through the MASH. So around about 125,000 contacts will come into MASH. So that's phone calls, emails, as I've said. Of those, around about 55,000 will go right through to the MASH, where the police, children's services and health will consider all of the information in more detail and work the case. The work that comes out of the MASH will go on to the children's social workers, and they undertake about 15,000 assessments every year. The Section 47, and I'll explain that later on, but that's a child protection investigation. So you can see there that there were nearly 5,000 child protection assessment stroke investigations over the course of last year. Of those, children went on child protection plans, and I'll explain about that as well. Another almost 1,500 became subject to a child protection plan. We issued court proceedings for another 130 children, and an additional 640 children came into care. So what you can see is there's a large volume, a large churn of work that goes on within the Children and Families branch. And we'll talk about some of that in a bit more detail now. So the social work teams consist primarily of what we call children's assessment and safeguarding teams and the disabled children's teams. And I'll just explain a little bit about what they do. So we have 30 CAST teams, as we call them, and 4 disabled children's teams. They take all of the new work coming out of MASH. MASH make the final decision about whether it needs a social work assessment. These teams will then undertake that assessment. And as you can see, they have to be completed within 45 days. The vast majority are completed significantly earlier than that. These teams also undertake a range of Section 47 duties. That's the regulation which covers child protection investigations. And they will deal with those in the same day if there's a child at risk. Sometimes when they've undertaken their assessments, they will pass the family back down to early help because they don't need an ongoing social work service. So you can see that there's routes into these social work teams and also exit routes as well. Next slide, please. So the term child in need is a specific term. It's set in regulation, comes from the Children Act 1989, and it places a specific duty on the local authority. If as a result of an social work assessment, we determine that the child has unmet needs, then we have a duty to meet those needs. We, as in the local authority, doesn't mean that we will do it alone. Sometimes there may be health needs, but the responsibility to orchestrate the support for those families sits with us. And as you can see, we have a duty to safeguard and promote the welfare of children and promote the upbringing of children within their families wherever possible. And that's an important point. I really want to stress this. Our function is to keep families together, to keep children at home where it's safe and appropriate to do so. Sadly, we can't always do that. Next slide, please. So just to summarise then, those 30 child assessment and safeguarding teams and the 4 disabled children's teams, they work with the lower level in children and families terms families to reduce risk, to promote the welfare of children, and to make sure that any unmet needs are met. Sometimes, though, risks cannot be safely managed in that way. And as we'll go on to talk about, sometimes we do have to put the matters before the court and ask the judge to make a decision about whether a child is safe to remain living at home. And we'll go on to the next part of the service now, which is around child protection. So we've done our assessment, we've been working with the family to address the unmet needs of the child. What happens if actually it's not working or that the risks to a child increase? Well, we have a specific duty around undertaking a child protection investigation. And we will agree sometimes in the MASH, sometimes if it's an open case just between the social work team and the police, we'll agree whether that's a joint investigation. So the police and a trained social worker together, or whether it's a single agency. And it may be that the police go and do the investigation on their own, or the social work team do. The child is always seen as possible, always within 24 hours. Our practice standard is the same day wherever possible. The child is usually spoken to alone. There's the exceptions to that will be if they have particular communication difficulties, or of course if they're very young. But wherever possible, we speak to the child alone. And in some cases, they would be what we call joint interviews, which is there's a phrase called achieving best evidence. And what that means is the child is video interviewed in a specialist room, usually attached to a police station, not always. And what we will do is that the trained police officer and the trained social worker will gently interview the child, and that could save them then having to give evidence in court at a later date, should that become necessary. Next slide, please. So after we've done the child protection investigation, Children's Services then make a decision whether actually the risks warrant a child protection conference. And the child protection conference is a multi-agency meeting. It involves all of the family and the child on occasions where that's the right thing to do. And they analyse the information and discuss the risks and consider whether a child protection plan is required. And this is a particular plan. It's the most significant plan you can have as a child, because what it says is you are at risk, significant risk of harm. And that conference will decide whether the risk should be badged as neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, or emotional abuse. And it's important that because it helps to explain to the family what we're really worried about and what they need to do to address those risks and what we will do to support them. And if the plan is required, if the conference agrees that, there'll be a core team of professionals who will work with the child. It's always led by the social worker, though. That's our specific responsibility. Next slide, please. So that plan is reviewed initially at 3 months. There's interim meetings as well. And as you can see there, at the end of February 2021, there are approximately just over 1,000 children subject to child protection plans in Hampshire. The social worker must visit the child every 10 working days. That's our practice standard. Sometimes it's more often than that, but they're not doing that alone. There'll be other professionals involved as well. The school, might be a health visitor, a range of professionals, making sure that as far as we possibly can, and there's no guarantees, of course, because we're not there 24 hours a day, making sure that the child is safe. And then if this doesn't work, sometimes children can be on a child protection plan for 12 months or even 18 months by exception. If that doesn't work, then, and those risks are still continuing to rise or they're not reducing, we will then consider commencing legal proceedings to seek the court's decision on removing the child. The important point here, if you read some of the tabloids, you'd believe that social workers can go into a family's home and remove children. They absolutely cannot do that. The only people that can do that are the police on a short-term basis and the courts. What Children's Services will do is put the evidence before a family court judge and say, here's our evidence, judge. We don't think this child should be at home because it's not safe. And the judge, over a lengthy period of proceedings, will then make a final decision. All social workers can do is put that evidence to the court. Next slide, please. What this chart shows is the category of child protection plan in Hampshire for those just over 1,000 children. And what you can see, the most common form of abuse / risk for children is neglect. And neglect is quite a broad subject. That's not just deprivation, as in neglect, it covers domestic abuse, and domestic abuse is one of the biggest issues that we face. As I go on to talk about children that come into care, don't come into care because of themselves, they come into care because of their families and environment, not because of their own behaviours. And domestic abuse has a significant impact on the development and emotional well-being of children. Next slide, please. A little bit about the Disabled Children's Team. They work with around about 550 children. They are a very specialist service. They have a criteria, which is in the third bullet point there, a clearly identified disability, whether they are born with a disability, become disabled as a result of illness, accident or injury. But it is a high threshold, and rightly so, because it is a very specialist service. So these are the most disabled children in Hampshire, but they will receive a service from these 4 teams. Next slide, please. Now, they undertake the child protection investigations, they undertake the social work assessments, but they have some additional resources as well. So they, for example, will work with the family around direct payments, personal budgets to allow the families to purchase the supports that they feel they need. There's residential and family-based respite care, and one of the key pieces of work that we do is supporting children and their families with the transition to adult services. So some of the most disabled children will need lifelong care, and it's important that transition to adult services is as smooth as possible. Next slide, please. So let's carry on with the journey. We've gone to court and the judges agreed that yes, actually those children should not be at home. The risks are too great. They need to come into the care of the local authority. What I would say is we should never underestimate the trauma that our children in care have suffered. As elected members, you have a corporate parenting responsibility for all of our children in care. And in the course of your travels, you may well come across them. And they are a delight, a real pleasure to work with and to meet. But they've all suffered trauma. It's really important that we keep that in mind in terms of the services that we provide. As I've said before, children are in care because of parental difficulties, not because of the child. There are 2 routes into care. One is through the courts, as I've explained, and the other is what we call Section 20 or voluntary care. Voluntary care used to be very popular. It would account for about 70% of the children that were in the care of the local authority. That's changed now. The court processes have changed, and about 75% of the children that come into care of Hampshire County Council come in through the court process. The other 25% are by that voluntary agreement. And typically that might be a very disabled child whose parents simply cannot manage the level of care that's required. So they come into care and they might go into specialist residential care. Just to touch on the last bullet point, unaccompanied asylum seeking children, where they disembark, that's where the local authority takes responsibility for them as children in care. Typically what happens in Hampshire is they will disembark from the back of lorries on the A34 or on the M3 or Rownham's, the M27, and then Hampshire becomes the responsible local authority. Okay, next slide, please, Steve. So where are our children in care? The significant majority are cared for by foster carers. Our Hampshire County Council foster carers go through a long assessment process. They provide some really high quality care. Through COVID, for example, we've had our foster carers openly volunteering to take children into their homes from homes where we know COVID has, parents have been infected with COVID, or the child might have been symptomatic, but despite that, they've welcomed them into their homes. Sometimes those children are there short term while we work to get them back home. Sometimes they come into care and they remain in long-term placements. A small number of our children are placed in children's homes. I'll go on to explain about our own homes from the independent sector, because there are just more children in care than placements available, and so they will go into the independent sector. Those placements can be very expensive. The average cost, this is the average cost of a child in care, is £60,000 for that placement. When we have 1,600, that's an awful lot of money, as Steve explained earlier. We have 5 children in care social work teams who work with children who are in care long term. Doesn't mean they're not still trying to work for them to go back home, but in the main, they are in long-term settled placements. Okay, next slide, please, Steve. We're getting towards the back end of the journey of the child now. We've gone through from early help, through the front door, through our child protection processes. When children in care reach the age of 18, they become known as a care leaver. Sometimes you might hear the phrase care experience. They have an allocated personal advisor rather than a social worker. And in Hampshire, what we do is when the child reaches 16, we introduce them to their personal advisor who works alongside the social worker, getting to know the young person, talking about and preparing them for adulthood and thinking what we can do to make sure we promote their needs into adulthood. We have 4 care leaders teams, and you can see there they provide practical, emotional and some financial support. A small number of our care leavers will experience significant mental health issues. They will have substance misuse issues, all of that related to the trauma that they've suffered. Coming into care is a positive experience, and we do everything we can to make it life-changing for the better. But nonetheless, we can't detract from the experiences that many have suffered during their childhood before they came into care. But that's a small number. If we look at the vast majority of our care leavers do incredibly well. I think we have around 50 care leavers at the university currently. The vast majority will find employment as they go into adulthood, and many will be holding down a job, having a mortgage and just living a life like everybody else. But they have gone through, nonetheless, the trauma of a disrupted childhood. Next slide, please, Steve. Just a little bit on fostering then. As it says at the top there, fostering is caring for somebody else's child in your own home, and it is. Foster carers are not employees of the local authority. We pay them an allowance to meet the needs of the child, and that's around what the child's needs are. But they are part of the professional team around the child, and that's an important point. The carer has as much expertise, they know the children, and they undertake a range of different tasks. Sometimes they are caring for a newborn baby for a short period of time whilst we're looking for an adoptive placement. Sometimes they're providing long-term care for a teenager, or they might be supporting the social worker in helping to reunify the child with their parents. So they undertake a range of different activities as part of that team around the child. Next slide, please. And now we're coming to the back end of the service, so I will be shutting up in a second. Just a little on adoption. So adoption offers permanence to children who need a loving and secure family. Adoption is usually for children as a benchmark, 5 and under. And the reason we say that, it's not always, but in the main, the reason we say that is because they would have otherwise developed such attachments to their birth family. It's very difficult indeed for them to then form new attachments with who are in effect stranger adults. Legally and permanently become part of the adopter's family. This is a really important point. The birth family have no legal responsibility for that child, no legal duties to that child, and often will have no contact with that child going forward. Across Hampshire, Isle of Wight, Portsmouth and Southampton, we have a regional adoption agency led by Hampshire. So I line manage the head of the regional adoption agency. That is part of government's policy to increase the pool of adopters who can then children can be placed with. And I have to say, we have, and I make no bones about this, one of the top performing regional adoption agencies in the country. We should be very proud of the fact that we are securing permanent homes for Hampshire children where they need it. And again, just to reiterate, the adoption order is permanent. It can't be undone once an adoption order is made. Next slide, please, Steve. Mentioned earlier about residential. Some children can't live in a family setting. I don't believe that should be the case for a large number of children. The vast majority can, but there are a small number who can't. We've had a big investment in our children's homes. We have 8 new children's homes, and members are welcome to visit children's homes in their locality if they'd like to. We can certainly arrange that. The homes have 4 children each, because managing typically adolescents who have suffered exceptional trauma in groups larger than that just isn't beneficial to the children, and it's a very difficult position to be in. It's worth noting that we have a secure unit. This is not a mental health secure unit or a criminal secure unit. This is a welfare secure unit. So where we've applied to the court for a secure order because the child is at such risk in the community, usually through threat of others. That might be exploitation from adults. But we have, it's a 16-bedded unit, although typically we wouldn't be looking to place 16 children at any one time. Next slide, please, Steve. And I think this is my last slide. Just very briefly then, just you can see the change in activity over what's a 5-6 year period. The middle part of the table is really interesting. So this is the contacts. This is contacts coming into our MASH, as I described at the beginning of the presentation. You can see in 2015 we were having around about 3,186 in a month. You look, so that would have been a year actually, looking at these numbers. If you look at March 2021, you can see it was 125,000. So there's been a huge increase in demand. And what I would end by saying is, throughout the pandemic, we've kept the services going. We've responded to all of the child protection investigations, as you would expect, as per normal. But it's worth noting that demand has increased by about 20% over the last 4 to 5 months, and it's been sustained at that increased level. We think that's directly attributable to COVID and the pandemic, and the fact that families have been struggling with their mental health and accessing other supports. So we are an exceptionally busy service currently. And I think that's my last slide, Steve. Yes.
Okay, so Chair, very happy to take, if we take a pause now, I'm very happy to take questions on that section.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you, Stuart. And just to say, I've visited the Hampshire Children's Home in my division, and I would recommend members go and do so if they're lucky enough to have one in their patch, because it's well worth doing so. I can't actually see any hands, but I'm sure members will have some questions. Councillor Bill Withers.
You were talking about safeguarding children, and just a question on a sort of example that's worrying me at the moment. There are known traffickers dealing on a junction right next to an infant school. And is this an item which the MASH would get involved in?
Yes, Councillor, we have a specialist team around child exploitation. That they deal with child exploitation, what you might think of as street gangs, etc. But that the MASH they take referrals about all welfare issues and issues of concern. So if you think there are issues that relate to children and there's safeguarding issues, then I'll make sure that you've got the contact details for the MASH so that you can pass those on. But they will certainly investigate that. And sometimes what they will also do is they will, when we get the information and we share it with the police will say, oh, we've got some intelligence here as well, and they can put things together, and that's how we start operations to disrupt such activity.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just think actually from what you've said, it gives us a greater priority on looking at that matter. And noting it in one area in my division, I'm sure it'll be a common practice in other divisions.
Thank you. Councillor Juliet Henderson, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much, Stuart, for that presentation. Really, really comprehensive and very helpful. With regards to taking children into care and neglect, I'm interested in this idea that has come up earlier of how departments link. So, for example, when you're looking at neglect, can you quantify how many of those parents have problems with addictions, or drug addictions and things like that? And if you pick that sort of thing up, can you then feed that into public health so that they become aware of the increasing nature of the problem?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We would estimate that of the 11,000 cases that we have open, one of what we call the trigger trio are involved with the adults in about 80% of those cases. The trigger trio being domestic abuse, adult mental health, or adult substance misuse. So with all of those cases, about 80%, we think one or more of those factors are present. Yet I don't actually have resources for adults, as you rightly point out. Some of the work that we've been doing within the branch has been to encourage other partners to place specialists within our social work teams so that we can more easily work with the adults and reduce the risk to children. And we've got a small number of those currently. Obviously, we would like to have more. We're having discussions with, ongoing discussions with colleagues. But yes, we will refer. So what will happen is a social worker working with a family where there are domestic abuse issues will make a referral to domestic abuse services. We will encourage them to prioritise it because obviously it's impacting severely on children, and they will then work along, become part of that team around the family. And the same for substance misuse and for adult mental health. But it's important to say they also have other priorities. We are not always the priority, and therein is the problem, I suppose.
Thank you very much.
Can't see any other hands, but if any member of the committee would like to ask a question, if they just unmute and go ahead.
Chair, there's just a question from Councillor Branson in the chat. Can you let us know if we have a home in our division? We can. We're not supposed to publicise the addresses of the children's home. That's quite right, because some of those children are there. So you won't find it on the website because of the nature of some of their backgrounds. We'll find a way to let you know the area in which those children's homes are, and we'll pop a note out through the chair, or if that's okay with you.
Of course, yeah, that's absolutely fine. I can't actually see the chat. It just says it's muted for me, but that's fine. Just let me know if any other questions arise. Otherwise, Steve, back to you.
Okay, thank you. I'll just go back into present mode, and then we're going to. Oh, sorry, I just see a hands popped up.
Councillor Mumaleni.
Yes, sorry. So the children homes, how easy it is to go there? You know, is it straightforward? Reason is when I
to visit children's homes. Yes, it is absolutely straightforward. In terms of arranging it, we can put all the measures in place. The straightforwardness ends the minute you walk through the door, when you're confronted with 4 teenagers and all the rest of it and everything that they bring with it. But that's in terms of the visit, it's absolutely fine to do that. We'll come back to you on how to do that. Okay. So yeah, I can see a number of members are saying they'll be interested to visit. So we'll put a note out that explains how we can arrange it and so forth. Okay, so let's go back into the presentation, and I'm going to put it on screen. So just bear with me for a second. Okay, can somebody just give me a yes if that's back on the screen?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, it is.
Thank you very much. So next bit of this then is our Education and Inclusion branch, and I'm going to hand over to Brian Pope, who's going to walk you through this bit of our services. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you, Steve. Do you want to flip the slide on? Morning, members. So I thought what I'd start off with is just sharing the diversity of the education system in Hampshire and just give you some kind of facts and figures around that. So you'll see there we've got a huge number of early years settings, well over 1,000 of those. 3 maintained nurseries maintained by the county council, but the vast majority of our early years settings are not in a non-maintained sector. You'll see there the numbers of schools we've got. So there's 425 either infant, junior or primary schools, 37 of those have got specialist resource provisions as well. We have 2 all-through schools, Alderwood in Aldershot and Westgate in Winchester, so they cater 4 to 16. 66 secondary schools, of those 20 have got resourced provisions for special educational needs children, and 8 of them have got a 6th form attached to them as well. On top of that, we've got 27 special schools. There are 12 post-16 colleges of differing types across the county. So some are FE, some are 6th form colleges, some are now academies, but there are 12 post-16 colleges. And then in terms of other provision, we've got 6 pupil referral units, which is the provision that the County Council has commissioned to ensure we've got somewhere to fulfil our statutory responsibilities to give full-time education for children who have been excluded permanently after 6 days. And we also have an alternative provision down in the New Forest as well. You can see at the bottom a little pie chart which shows you the split between academy and maintained. It's very different by sector. So in the secondary sector, just over half of the schools have now chosen to become academies. In the primary sector, nearly all primary schools have tended to remain with the local authority and are still maintained, but those are the percentages as of the moment. Thank you, Steve. Important to make this point, successive governments have given greater and greater autonomy to schools, so they are autonomous, self-managing institutions. And it's important to recognise that we don't run schools. So sometimes I get asked if I can go in and have a word with the head teacher to change the way they're running the school. The answer to that, I'm afraid, is no. Schools have got powers over the way that they organise themselves. It doesn't mean to say we can't exert a leadership function, and we do quite often. And really, we've only got intervention powers if a maintained school is underperforming. And definition of underperforming really is that it has been judged to be inadequate by Ofsted, or that the data is showing a huge decline in standards, or that financially it's underperforming as well. So it's running up a big deficit. And those are the incidents where we can intervene. Safeguarding, of course, being the other one where we would intervene. The Secretary of State has the intervention powers. They're exercised through the Regional Schools Commissioner if an academy is underperforming. And in recent years, we've got very, very close to the Regional Schools Commissioner. We work hand in glove with them. So if we do have an academy that is underperforming, I liaise directly with the Regional Schools Commissioner, and we do work in partnership to intervene where it's an academy that's underperforming. It's a very close relationship we've now developed. Thank you. We've always had a very strong and I think shared vision for education, shared amongst county council officers, members. Whenever I've presented at the select committee, these have been the kind of themes that members have been interested in, and also school leaders across Hampshire. So we do believe in high standards in reading, writing and maths, and we've got a strong academic tradition around those core subjects. They are lifelines to enable children to go on and have successful lives. So we do have a relevant focus on those core subjects. However, I'm yet to come across anybody working in Hampshire that doesn't have a commitment to providing a much broader curriculum than that. So for us, the humanities are still desperately important. PE, drama, the arts are really important as well. So we do work with schools to ensure that they are providing a broad, relevant and exciting curriculum. We want children to be enthralled by learning and wanting to participate as well. We also recognise that there are important social skills and the development of emotional intelligence that's important as well. And we work with schools and have professional development around developing what we call good learning habits. So things like how you develop resilience in children, persistence, kind of stickability on a task. Creativity is really important, and that mindset that children believe that they can achieve. And last but by no means least, we do think that schools should be places where schools have a safe, enjoyable and memorable childhood as well. It shouldn't just be about preparation for adulthood. being a child is a phase in itself, and it's really important that that's a time of great memories where children have a great, enjoyable time in school as well. So these are some principles that we have that underpin our approach to school improvement in Hampshire. These came about really because Ofsted a few years ago said that the two most successful jurisdictions were Hampshire and Wigan. Not sure how Wigan got sneaked in there alongside Hampshire, but they did at the time. And the DfE commissioned a piece of work where they were looking at the most successful school improvement systems. It was led by a company called ISIS, and they came down and looked at the principles that underpinned our approach to school improvement. So the first one is an absolute commitment to ensure that all schools are good or outstanding for all children. And that's different from saying that all schools should be good or outstanding, because what we want to ensure is that all children, no matter whether they're boys, they're girls, what their ethnicity is, whether they come from rich backgrounds, poor backgrounds, we would want all schools to be good for all children. And we make that absolutely crystal clear with school leaders. And it's a principle that's shared by school leaders. We do agree with autonomy. There's no point appointing high quality school leaders if you don't allow them to lead. We do agree that having some competitiveness amongst schools is a good thing. However, in Hampshire, we've worked really hard to ensure that schools collaborate jointly with each other and they work closely with the local authority, and there's joint ownership of the endeavours to meet the needs of all children as well. Our system, we believe, should be co-constructed and led by local education leaders, but that's not just by head teachers, it is by the people that we employ within the county council as well to exercise a leadership function. It's very much a partnership endeavour. We have an extensive local authority team. We still have got a team of around 60 inspectors advisors, and those are largely drawn from schools. So they are school leaders that have been outstanding whilst they were a head teacher. We have 16 primary heads, for example, work for us, all of whom have had at least one very successful headship, and teachers that have been heads of departments and lead on subjects like art, geography, history, and so on. So we've got a wide range of expertise that we can offer schools. Thank you. The next one should be blindingly obvious, but it's not always, I'm afraid. So we always try and build our work around evidence, and we draw very widely on the work of people like Hattie and the Sutton Trust, so that we're led by the evidence of what works well and what's likely to impact on student progress, rather than just going along with the latest fad of the moment. And I'm afraid in education, quite often, there are fads, and there is research which is not really research, it's very opinion based. So we do try and make sure that we work from a proper evidential base, and we do also try and make sure that professional judgment is morally exercised for the good of children as well. So we believe that school improvement is accelerated and we get better outcomes when there's commitment to building capacity amongst teachers, 10,000 teachers in Hampshire, and we try and make sure that we've got a proper professional development programme to make them better teachers. And we try and ensure there's collaboration and we move knowledge and expertise around the system from one school to another. So quite often we'll use schools as exemplars where we can see good practice for the schools to learn from as well. We work really hard at making sure there is alignment between the views of head teachers and the local authorities' strategic coordination and responsibilities and the use of resources. So that partnership approach which welds head teachers to the local authorities is one that we believe is paramount to our success. We know that school leaders drive the system. Of course they do. They are running their own schools. We are providing support and influence, but they drive the system. But also there is a recognition amongst head teachers that not all educational leadership resides in schools. And there are some local authorities that no longer have a school improvement system, and I don't think they are as successful as Hampshire because we have got some residual expertise in our school improvement service. And then firm commitment to the belief that schools need to exercise their best judgment in determining what's right for their community as well. Quite often the curriculum might look slightly different in one area of the county to another area because different communities have got slightly different needs and are made up differently. I'll share the data, but you'll recognise that there have been no examinations now for 2 years because of COVID. So these are quite hopelessly out of date. And actually, for many of these areas, they're areas that we have continued to work on, and we think we would have seen an improvement in those outcomes had it been a period of non-COVID and schools had been operating as they should do. So early years I would describe as outstanding in Hampshire. Every time we have an inspection, every time Ofsted look at the way we work in early years, it's always held up in very high regard. The key measurement there is children getting what they call the good level of development at the end of year R, which is the end of the first year in primary schools and infant schools. And we have 76% of our students at that age achieving the good level of development compared to a national average of 71%. So I think that shows that in Hampshire, across that broad good level of development, our children are in a good place comparatively to the rest of the nation. By the end of primary school, these are how Hampshire children do compared to national averages. We have what they call a group of statistical neighbours, which are the local authorities that are most like Hampshire. And those are the authorities with which we compare ourselves and which the DFE and Ofsted compare us with. And amongst our statistical neighbours, we are Stat Neighbour first for reading, Stat Neighbour first for writing, Stat Neighbour first for mathematics. So there's some really good work that happens across our primary sector. And like Stuart and Steve was saying, that's not to say we're complacent. And it's not to say that averages can't hide areas of underperformance as well. And we're only too conscious of those and work with the schools that are underperforming to ensure that they are turned around and get on back on track and get better outcomes as quickly as they possibly can. But by and large, again, very successful primary sector. And then finally, the key stage 4 outcomes, and you'll be delighted to know that this is subject to an annual report that comes to Select Committee. And we do our best every year to explain the vagaries behind the Attainment 8 methodology and the Progress 8 methodology, which basically are scores that government have invented to show attainment across 8 subjects that have been picked by government as ones that count. So some qualifications count in those and some don't. And that, of course, drives some behaviours in schools as to which subjects they try and encourage children to undertake, because obviously that has an impact on Attainment 8 and Progress 8. But that will be subject, you'll be pleased to know, to an annual report, and we'll unpick those and show you which subjects that children do really well in Hampshire and which are the subjects we're focusing on to try and get further improvement. That data's 2 years out of date, and we've done an awful lot of work in secondary schools in recent time, and it would have been really interesting to see what the outcomes would have been this year as a result of that work. The basics figure is the proportion of children getting a grade 4, which is equivalent to an old grade C in the old GCSEs in both English and maths. So again, you'll see that we're slightly above the national average on that figure as well. A statistic I think members ought to be very proud of, and I know I am, that nationally 86% of schools are judged to be good or outstanding. So that's 14% that are obviously requiring improvement, or worse than that, inadequate. We're 7 whole percentage points above that, so comparatively are doing incredibly well as a local authority there. We've got 93% of schools that are good or outstanding. Again, that's not to say that we're complacent about that. We have a programme of work around all those schools that are currently judged as requiring improvement or inadequate. Ofsted have continued to visit those schools during the pandemic, And in every occasion, they have concluded that they are on track to be judged good by the time of the next full inspection, when Ofsted can resume full inspection again. So yes, there are areas where there are more required improvement schools than we would like, but we are working with those, and in every one of the monitoring visits, the local authority's support has been praised. There has not been one monitoring visit to any RI school where the local authority's intervention work has not been praised with those schools. So our outcomes across all key stages and measures have been strong overall across Hampshire. The secondary phase is an improving phase, and we've seen real improvements in recent years, and we've evidenced that through reports to this select committee. I have to say primary has been consistently strong over the last decade or so. Our focus has really been on the secondary phase in recent years. But there is some variability amongst groups of children. There are some groups for whom we do really well. So pupils with English as a second language we do incredibly well with. Really important to me that as part of the military covenant we do really well for those children with a service background, and I'm pleased to say in Hampshire that those children with a service background actually outperform the rest of Hampshire children, which I think is a good place to be. And you know, it's as a result of some really good work between the University of Winchester, our school improvement team, the schools that take those military children, plus the services themselves. There's really good work around that. And the area where we are working really hard and really keen to see improvements are for those children that are on free school meals, those that are got special educational needs, and actually some of the groups that Stuart has described earlier on in his presentation, children that are children in need, looked after children subject to a child protection plan. So those are the areas where we need to see further improvement, and we have programmes of work with schools around that. Just some key personnel so you're aware of who's who. This is how it is currently. There are a couple of changes in this from September. So Eric Holton, who has come along to this committee in the past, is our County Education Manager for early years and primary education. He line manages a variety of 5 school improvement managers of primary across Hampshire. He also line manages the music service as well. So the music service comes under Eric. David Hardcastle is leaving us at the end of August. I know you'll be saddened to hear that because David's made some good contributions to this committee in recent years. He's been replaced by a woman called Natalie Smith. She will also line manage Governor Services as part of her responsibility as well. Karen Nye is the County Education Manager for Vulnerable Children and Young People. Because of our focus on disadvantaged children, children open to social care and SEND, I created that post a couple of years ago with some key team members underneath to try and drive at those outcomes. Pleased to let you know, or perhaps not pleased to let you know, Tracy Sanders has been successful in securing a promoted post in Surrey. She's going to become the Assistant Director in Surrey County Council. So we're currently going through the recruitment process for her success, and I'll be able to tell you hopefully next term who that successor will be. Philip Walker is our post-16 lead and deals with the skills agenda and the participation agenda. So we work really hard at making sure that children are not, that they are in employment, education and training. We have very strong figures compared to the rest of the country around that, and largely that's due to the work that schools, colleges do with Philip's team. And then finally, the last person on my branch management team is Janet Barrow, who is our business manager and makes sure that the finances, particularly around hires, all kind of stack up. So those are the kind of core people that report through to me. Thank you, Steve. I think that was my last slide.
Thanks. I'll just stop presenting now. Okay, over to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. We've got a couple of questions for you, Brian. First is Councillor Aaron Mamaleni, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Steve and Ren, for your update on this. Yes, I'm very proud that Hampshire is on the top with the 93% of the schools are outstanding or good, and a proud resident of Hampshire. However, I would be very grateful if there are any regional disparities in this achievement. That means within the Hampshire itself is a very big county, and the reason why am I asking this question is unfortunately my division or my area is only 42% of the schools are good or outstanding, and I'm commenting about the secondary schools. So it looks like there is a regional disparity in this achievement. Another statistics that I'm looking for is there any attrition between primary to the secondary school? So in the Basingstoke area region, I see loads of families are moving out from Basingstoke for the secondary education as their kids, they're moving out, families from Basingstoke to neighboring counties, especially to the Berkshire and Surrey and other areas for better secondary education. That is one of the reasons they are giving it to me. Do you have any comment on this?
Yeah, yes, I do. I understand you've written to Councillor Chad and asked for a briefing on that. I've had a conversation with Councillor Chad yesterday. One of the things we do for all members is we bring you together in district groups once a year to discuss all the schools in your district. We're going to arrange those for next term, and we'll start off with Basingstoke because of your concerns. So that will be going in the diary for September. We can explore this in great detail then. Yes, you are right. There are too many schools currently judged as requiring improvement in Basingstoke. However, I would say it is my professional judgment that as soon as Ofsted are able to re-inspect those schools, we are expecting a number of those to end up with a good judgment. So I can talk to you about one school that's recently had a Section 8 monitoring visit. The report's not in the public domain yet, so I can't name it. But the Ofsted inspector was so convinced that that school that's currently judged RI, requiring improvement, is good, that she's demanded that Ofsted bring back a team before the end of term to re-inspect it fully. So that HMI's Majesty's Inspector is putting their neck on the line a little bit by bringing that team back in. So they must be fairly confident that that's a school that no longer requires improvement, but is a good school. So I'm hoping by the end of the term, one of the secondary schools will have moved from requiring improvement to good, is my sincere hope. Some of the others, I think, when they are re-inspected, will no longer be requiring improvement. I think they are now fundamentally good schools. So I think you'll see some shift in that statistics, but we can go through that in much more detail when we do the briefing. The other bit is about movement out of the district. Again, there's a flow of pupils into the district and out of the district. However, again, we can show you the data which shows that Basingstoke secondary schools have become more popular in the last 2-3 years, and actually we're starting to get to a point where some of the schools are getting oversubscribed. But again, I'm really happy to share that data with you when we meet as a group with Basingstoke councillors.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Officer.
No problem. Next, we've got Councillor Jackie Porter, please.
Thank you. My question really is about the special needs, the SEND provision that we have. And you touched on it in terms of the number of extra provisions that have been made in schools additionally. But I just think it'd be useful for this committee to know how the SEND is organised and what you're doing as part of the improvement of the number of places that are being offered.
Yeah. You'll be pleased to know that on the forward plan, it might even be the next meeting, I think it's the November meeting, we're bringing a full report around SEND to this committee so we can expose all aspects of SEND to the select committee. I think It's important that we do that in the round. The other bit we've done is we've arranged for an all-member briefing next term on SEND, because I do know that it's something that's in everybody's inboxes as well. So that's in train as well. But all aspects of SEND will be looked at. I mean, in terms of places, we're working really hard to create new places as a result of the increase in pupils with EHCPs. In 2014, before the legislation was brought in, we had 4,900 old statements. When I last checked last week, we had 11,117 EHCPs. So you can see we've almost doubled the number of students with an EHCP, which of course puts a huge pressure on us, requiring additional specialist accommodation. We've got plans in train, and I've indeed already created hundreds of additional places. We've got plans in train for an additional 300 places over the next 18 months. There's a report going to the cabinet member on the 16th of July to open up another 12 additional resource provisions. We've just finished the public consultation on that. So yes, we are working incredibly hard to increase the amount of provision, but we also need to look at the rationale and the reasons why so many children apparently now need an EHCP compared to just 6 years ago. But there will be a full report where we can debate these issues properly at the November committee.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bill Withers.
Brian, first of all, I thank all the excellent presentations so far, but particularly all the work you're doing at the moment with the schools over COVID. And I know it's a difficult task, but thank you for the way you communicate with us in an excellent fashion. Similar to what Councillor Jackie Porter was going to say, it is a very hot topic, and I know it's a subject that has been discussed on the scrutiny committee. However, it is this committee's role. There are a lot of people seeking, obviously, places for SEND and under the education and health care plans, and there has been a question mark over the time it takes to do it. But I understand that each individual is different, and therefore putting the plan together is extremely difficult. But I do think what must come out of the report and everything is our method of communicating to the public to ensure that they understand fully the comprehensive work that you do to establish those plans.
Thank you, Councillor Withers. We'll make sure it is comprehensive and it does contain all those points when we bring that to the committee. And thank you for your comments on COVID. Sometimes I do feel I report to Simon Bryant as the Director of Public Health rather than Steve on occasions at the moment. So yeah, I spent last evening poring over the new guidance that the government issued yesterday, and obviously we're now working on guidance that we're sending out to schools on that.
Yeah, thank you.
And welcome to another Jackie to the committee, Councillor Jackie Tustain.
Thank you, Chair. Probably Brian again. I think this might be for. We obviously talk about inclusion for SEND as well, and getting places. And I know there is obviously always a drive to try and include children, and inclusivity is obviously very important. My concern, what I'd like to understand, is what provision is put in for training staff to make sure they have all the relevant training for people, for the children that come in with SEND, because quite often it does mean that you end up with children who end up being corridored, which then causes more problems in going forward into the future. And obviously secondary school and adolescence is a very complex time for young people. So I just would like to know what the sort of Hampshire's policy is with this, because it's something that's obviously a very complex area, and if there's anything, any guidance, or you've got any briefings on that sort of stuff.
Again, very happy to come along and talk to the committee on that and give a kind of wider proportion on that. In terms of permanent exclusion, just to kind of show how inclusive the system is, if we were permanently excluding children at the national rate, we'd have 200 permanent exclusions a year. We don't. We have 8.
Sorry, I wasn't talking about exclusion.
No. I'm coming.
Right, yeah. Sorry.
So that's at the extreme end of inclusion, and the reason why they're not being permanently excluded is our schools do work really hard with the local authority to try and do in-house provision, so they don't need to resort to permanent exclusion. In terms of training for teachers, we employ a primary behaviour service which has 6 centres across the county, which is funded from the high needs block, so that when schools have a child that's exhibiting really challenging behaviour, they've got a service that's free at the point of delivery in primary schools for them to have training for the individual teacher or indeed whole staff training. Some of that can be the teacher, one of the teachers in the primary behaviours team, modelling the teaching and actually showing the teacher the kind of techniques they can be used in. So we've got that service available. For secondary schools, we have outreach provided by our special schools for SEMH, social, emotional, mental health, and also our pupil referral units provide training for secondary schools through an outreach budget that they get as well. We also have a range of sold services around that. So our educational psychology service also provides centre-based training, whole school training, or training to small numbers of individuals in schools, but that's dependent on the schools purchasing that support, and schools are responsible for their own professional development. We try and influence initial teacher training as well. So I've got colleagues in our service that do lecture on initial teacher training to try and get core messages around inclusion over that, but largely that's something for school-based initial teacher training and the universities that provide teacher training as well. So there's a kind of comprehensive package of professional development available in Hampshire, but because schools are autonomous, they will decide whether or not to access that or not for themselves. But we do have generally a fairly good take-up around that.
Okay, thank you.
And Councillor Malcolm Wade, please.
Thank you, Chairman. And having seen a number of these, I can say that all the presentations like this from the children's service officers are good, and thank you for that. Brian, when we talk about SEND in November, will we be covering the issue where families don't agree with the HCPs and covering the number that go to tribunals and how that works for the county? Because of that is an issue that perhaps many new members might not be aware of, and looking at the cost involved and the process and what's involved in that. Or do you see that as a separate item to discuss at a different meeting?
I'm really happy to cover that, Malcolm, at the time. I mean, we have relatively quite a small tribunal activity. It is an inevitable consequence of the SEN system as currently set up by national legislation, but we'll cover that as part of that report so that you've got access to that.
That's good, because that's something that many members, myself included, where people come to their local councillor for support or to discuss it with them. So it's good for people to understand what they're talking about. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? Otherwise, we will go back to Steve for the next part of the presentation.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, Chair, and given a certain discomfort that I'm feeling about whether there might be a need for a comfort break.
That's absolutely fine.
I've got some thumbs up.
Thank
5
you.
minutes.
I'll pause the webcast. FM, please can the webcast be paused? Thank you. We've resumed.
Super, thank you. So we'll return to you, Steve.
Thank you very much. So the next bit of the presentation is going to be over to Suzanne Smith about our access and resources service, and I'll just try and put the presentation back up. There we go. If somebody can just give me an indication that that's there. Yeah, great. Thank you. Over to you, Suzanne.
Lovely. Thanks, Steve. Good morning, members. So, yeah, I'm here to talk to you about my bit of children's services, if you like. So on the next slide, just summarises the 3 primary areas of responsibility within my branch. So we've got access to services and to education, which covers things like school admissions and home to school transport, but also the sufficiency of childcare across Hampshire. We've then got resources, which is a bit of a mix of our own kind of financial resources and how we use them, but also some of the what we'd say the back office functions, the bits, the things we have to do to help the rest of the department to run smoothly. And then finally, in the business development area, we've got things like procuring contracts for services, grant allocations, but also the strategic responsibility for relationships with partners, particularly the NHS and public health in that area. So I'm just going to go through a few of those services in a little bit more detail with you, starting with home to school transport. So home to school transport is driven by a lot of statutory guidance, and we are operating at the kind of statutory minimum in terms of what we deliver, but that's still costing us £34 million a year. Got a few of the key bits of statutory guidance on the screen here. So we must provide transport to facilitate school attendance in certain circumstances. So depending on age, dictates whether or not you're deemed able to walk certain distances. But if a young person has SEND, then those individuals are looked at on a case-by-case basis to see if they have the mobility to get themselves to school or whether they require transport to facilitate that attendance. We must also provide transport if there isn't a safe walking route, and where there is the facility to charge, where families don't have the ability to pay that and they're in receipt of certain benefits, then they will receive that transport free of charge. So just in terms of the provision across Hampshire, on the next slide, we've got a few key metrics. So we're transporting over 12,000 children to and from school every year in some 5 million journeys. It's a real mix of SEND and mainstream pupils. Of the £34 million that we spend, around 18 to 20 million of that is spent on SEND transport, and that's a mix of both the transport provision itself, but also a number of those young people require a school escort, so and some assistance in the vehicle for the school journey, and we employ a number of school escorts directly through the county council. We also work with some of our transport operators to ensure that where necessary there's an additional adult in the car to oversee that journey to and from school. We've had multiple transformation programmes running in home to school transport, looking at how we can best manage both the market but also the access to transport, given the spend that we've got in that area. But we are, there are variables we can't control, not least petrol prices, which only ever go in one direction. We have a mix of different transport arrangements, so a number of mainstream schools where there are a significant number of pupils travelling. We may well use buses and coaches, right down to individual taxi journeys for some children where that's deemed the most appropriate way for them to travel. Moving on to school admissions, we have 3 primary admissions rounds in each year. So we have the start of school in year R, we have the infant to junior transition, and then the secondary school starts. Traditionally, we've had very high levels of parental preferences being met in terms of the school places that we're able to offer. And we administer the admissions round for all community and voluntary controlled schools across Hampshire. We publish our admissions policies again every year, and there is an admissions forum that meets 4 times a year where a number of members sit on that forum, kind of looking at admissions policy and guidance, advising and feeding into that. Schools also participate in that group. Again, it's a very heavily prescribed area. We have priority criteria that we use, and those are all published and in the public domain. But as well as the kind of the 3 main rounds, we also have children moving into and out of the area each year. So we process an additional 7,000 or so applications to support that movement within the system. The team also look after kind of tracking children who are missing education to try and secure them a school place as quickly as possible. Moving on to services. Oh, sorry. So there's a really close link between admissions and school place planning. Obviously, we wouldn't hit high levels of parental preference if we didn't have school places available for those children to go into. And Steve touched earlier in his introductory statements around the birth rate in Hampshire kind of declining. But a few years ago, we had a real kind of spike in the birth rate, and that's worked its way through the primary sector and is now hitting the secondary sector. So there's lots of close working goes on between Pete Colnutt's branch, and Pete will follow me in terms of presenting, and also Brian, to make sure that we are responding to those demographic changes, to what we can see happening with SEND, what we know about house building and the numbers of families moving into the area, to try and make sure that we have sufficient school places in the right places. So moving on. The services for young children is split in terms of responsibilities. Brian looks after the quality of that provision, and he's talked about the kind of the settings and the service in that respect. My responsibilities are around ensuring there is sufficient childcare, and then administering a £75 million budget that is passed from government through to us that we must use to pay providers for early years entitlements. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Brian gave the numbers earlier of the number of early years settings we've got, but actually if you add childminders into that mix, we've got over 1,800 childcare providers operating at any given time in Hampshire, and around 1,400 of those will be eligible for the early years entitlement funding that comes through the schools grant that we get. In addition to making sure that there are sufficient childcare places, we also have responsibilities to support those settings to be sustainable, to meet minimum standards, to ensure a good uptake, and also to promote the childcare offer to families across Hampshire. And one of the primary mechanisms we use to do that is the FISH website. And if you haven't seen that, it's a good source of information for members in kind of managing your mailboxes. It's the Family Information and Services Hub. It's online, and it's got a way in which you can search for various different children's services, childcare provision, holiday activities, short breaks across Hampshire. You can use different filters to get to different geographical areas, and we work on the FISH website as a way of promoting our childcare offer to families across Hampshire. Moving on to the funding arrangements, so that's 75 million that gets passed to us through the Dedicated Schools grant. We have to spend in a number of ways. 95% of that money has to be passed on to childcare providers. The remaining 5% we use to fund both the quality provision that Brian's service delivers and also the sufficiency function that I support. Providers access that early years entitlement funding through 3 core pots of money, if you like. Where family incomes are less than £16,000 per annum, families are entitled to 15 hours free of charge to them childcare, and we will pay for that childcare through that early years entitlement funding. When children reach 3 and 4, there is a universal entitlement for all 3 and 4-year-olds to access 15 hours of childcare per week. And then there is an extended entitlement where families are either lone working parents or both parents work, where they can access an additional 15 hours. That's where you get to the 30 hours free childcare offer that you might have heard about. And so different providers have different service offerings, but they will submit returns to us each term, and we will fund them for the number of hours in those 3 pots that they deliver. We work really closely with the childcare sector. They have a number of challenges, not least some of the hourly rates that are passed on can be difficult for some of those providers to operate within. Many of them in Hampshire are reliant on private parental income to top up, if you like, the money that they earn and to break even. And so some of the key challenges that they're experiencing at the moment are listed there on the right, and some of those have been exacerbated during COVID, particularly where childcare settings were closed or restricted for a period of time, and they really lost out on that private parental income. So we're doing lots and lots of work at the moment, really closely monitoring the sector, putting on webinars around how they can do effective business planning. And we're also just starting a piece of work to support the sector more widely around the recruitment challenges that they're facing to ensure that they have sufficient staff. So that's something that we may well come back to you on in due course to let you know how we're getting on with that, and to seek your support in sharing some of those materials with childcare providers in your area. Moving on, I have responsibility for our procurement and commissioning services. So in any given year, we're spending nearly £100 million on external services. And Stephen Stewart talked earlier about the cost of care being one of our primary costs. And we have external markets, and they are markets, unfortunately, because of the levels of profit being generated in the care sector, that we have to manage. And I have services who look at that from a more commercial perspective and ensure that we're compliant with all the relevant procurement legislation to try and ensure that we have value for money and high quality external service provision. And so they will we'll let contracts on average for around 4 years, but they are actively managed during those 4 years and then retendered to ensure that they meet the needs of the children and the way in which we're delivering services at any given moment in time. Also look after the placement commissioning team, who are the team of people who find placements for children and young people, and they feed the information that they get around those individual needs through into our strategic commissioned arrangements, so that we make sure that that's one of the mechanisms we use to make sure that the services we commission are appropriate for the children that we are trying to place. And then finally, in terms of the presentation today, I thought it'd be good to touch on short break activities. It's come to this committee a number of times in the past. So we have a statutory obligation to deliver short break activities to provide kind of fun and entertaining activities for disabled children, but also the primary purpose is to give families a break from caring. And we have transformed the way in which we deliver and commission those services a number of times in recent years. We work closely with Hampshire Parent Carer Network to set the priorities. So we've got a certain amount of grant funding that we can issue out. We work with those parent carer representatives to say, what is it that you really need and where do you need it? And the little pie chart that we've got at the bottom left there sets out the kind of priorities that they've set for us, and we then commission against those. We have done a lot of work in recent years around the Gateway Card, and the Gateway Card is something that families with a child with disabilities or SEND can apply for. And it gives them access to those short break activities. Over the last year, we had a lot of feedback from families to say that they didn't really necessarily want to access the short break activities, but they used their Gateway Card as a means for securing concessionary rates, a number of attractions or leisure facilities, and actually that's what they really wanted from the card. So recently we've split, and we've got 2 different types of Gateway Card now. We've got the basic one, which is simply about evidencing that you have a child with additional needs, and you can use to secure those concessions. And we're now building up that database of where the Gateway Card can be used for that purpose. And then we have the Gateway Card Plus, which is the card that you use to access the commissioned short break activities. And what that's really enabled us to do is look in real time at which families are using which type of activities and where, and to get smarter and smarter with the way in which we commission and use that grant funding that we've got. We've got 2,830 Gateway Card applications or that have been approved at the point of writing this presentation. We do ask for those to be refreshed every few years. You know, some children will have lifelong disabilities. Others might only need a card for a particular period of time. So again, in terms of just making sure that we're really targeted with how we use that pot of funding, that reapplication process supports us with that. So that's a bit of a canter through some of the services in my area, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you've now got.
Thanks. What I'm going to do, Suzanne and members, if it's okay, is just move us straight through to the next section, which is on strategic development, because I think it fits most closely with Suzanne's work as well. So I'm going to ask Pete to step up and do this presentation, then we'll break for questions at that point. So Pete, if you wouldn't mind just coming in at this stage.
Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, members. I'd like to take you through a high-level look at the strategic development branch, our roles and responsibilities, and link that to the Children's Services Capital Programme. And as Steve said at the outset, please take this as a reference point that we can come back to and pick up any further detail you'd like to cover. So one of the statutory roles of the local authority is to strategically plan school places. We do that working closely alongside Suzanne's branch, as she's already mentioned, and Brian's. It's to ensure a sufficiency of school places across the county, irrespective of governance. Brian shared with you earlier on about the number of community schools and the number of academies. And what we seek to do in terms of the school place planning activity is to try and deliver local schools for local children, irrespective of school governance. So we have projects of expanding community schools as well as academy schools, as well as delivering free schools. In terms of the 2021-22 capital programme, significant investment across the school estate of some circa 100 million. And to give you a bit of context scope of where we've been in the last few years, 2013 to 2023, we've delivered over 18,000 additional school places. And again, working with Suzanne, we also produce a school places plan, which is a sort of 5-year snapshot look in time. It's published annually. It's part of the January capital programme report that comes to this committee, to select committee, and we'll present that to you in January in the detail of that 5-year snapshot. As we've talked throughout this presentation, we're starting to see now a reduction in the number of the increase of births across Hampshire, but we are still seeing some significant numbers increase through major development areas, new housing developments. But anything that's driven by new housing obviously often gets caught up in the timescales of the delivery of that housing, which is sometimes takes longer to come through than originally suggested. The Children's Services Capital Programme is not just about schools. Stuart referenced earlier on, and I'm delighted to say that we did embark on a project to replace a number of our children's homes, funded from local Hampshire resources. And that's probably one of the most uplifting and exciting parts of my role over many years, actually working with children in care to seek their advice and support on how our new homes should look. In terms of the funding policy, the government makes available a few main areas of capital funding to us. Basic need, that's new school places. Capital maintenance, that's fixing the roofs and windows on our school estate. There's new funding come forward recently, I'm pleased to say, for SEND and also for schools devolved formula capital, and I'll touch on that later. But also just to reference the point that the DfE do expect wherever new housing is being delivered that developers make a contribution or actually cover the cost to mitigate the need for new school places. And again, to give you a flavour of the work, that a lion's share of the work that my branch undertakes, 2013 to 2020, we've secured £164 million worth of developer contributions, which has supported investing across the school estate. Next slide, Steve, thanks. This slide gives you a snapshot of the new schools planned in Hampshire by 2025. As many of you will be aware, all new schools now have to be an academy or a free school. Our first free school opened in September 19 in Borley Park near Botley. We opened 2 new primary schools last year, Barton Farm in Winchester and Stoneham Park in Eastleigh. They opened in September 2020, which I'm delighted to say that the teams managed to deliver those schools and the contractors, even with the challenges of COVID. We have Deer Park Secondary School, which is a 7FE school, which opens in September this year. And I stress in terms of that table that the schemes that are identified for 2024 onwards are subject to change as we move forward and we deliver those schools in line with new housing. This work is delivered working very closely alongside our colleagues in CCBS in terms of delivering and designing those new school places. Next slide, please. So in terms of special educational needs, we've had some conversation on that this morning. Brian's talked about the increasing pressure that's coming about through increased pupil numbers, but also through the EHCPs. Delighted to reference this new Austin Academy. That's a free school that we secured direct funding from the DFE to build in Basingstoke. That provides 125 ASD places and opened in April this year. Some members will also be aware that we've got a new 90-place SEMH school being delivered in Farnborough. That's costed at around £13 million. And we've got a number of other significant refurbishment and places projects planned across the SEN state, costed at circa 15 million. So a fairly substantial investment going into SEND, but always a need to provide more. Next slide, Steve. This slide gives you an indication of schools' devolved formula capital. So schools do receive a direct capital allocation. To give you a sort of feel for the size and value, a 2FE primary school would receive around about £9,000 a year, and a 1,000-place secondary would receive around about 20k for that. So that's for them to determine their own local capital priorities. And then the final slide for me, please, Steve. So I just wanted to just give you a flavour of some of the potential challenges and pressures on the programme. We do identify a potential deficit over the 5-year period of the programme. The report that we take to the lead member and to your select committee looks at a 3-year snapshot, but you'd expect me to look slightly further and longer ahead than that. We will seek to minimise that deficit as we work forward, and that'll be through government grant and potentially through developer contributions. We see a significant ramp up in new school places required post 2025 in major development areas. So a number of new schools will come into your vision as we bring forward the detailed plans and schemes, and that stresses the importance of developer contributions. Hampshire Construction has performed well through COVID. I've referenced the 2 primary schools that were delivered. But I do need to flag that the construction industry is starting to report a significant period of uncertainty at the moment regarding material availability and workforce shortages, with some lead-in times now starting to increase. So we're monitoring that really very carefully at the moment and need to understand whether that's a short-term or a longer-term factor. In terms of managing the capital programme, we do run a contingency. So we have a contingency to deal with those unforeseen items. And as I say, we'll monitor that carefully and keep you updated. In terms of final point, in terms of a sense check and challenge in terms of the work we do, I'm a member of a national body called the Education Building Development Officers Group that through Hampshire leads on a national benchmarking report, and that focuses on the cost of new buildings delivered across the country. It's valued now at 5.6 billion, so it's the largest benchmarking exercise ever undertaken. We do that in conjunction with Cabinet Office, DFE, the Local Government Association and MHCLG, and we use that as an external challenge. That sense checks the costs that we're delivering new school places for, but we absolutely work to ensure that we maintain the quality of the learning environment, and that work's done closely with our colleagues in CCBS. Thank you, members.
Okay, Chair, if you're okay, we'll pause there for questions before we go into the next bit.
Yeah, of course. We got any questions for Suzanne or Pete? I haven't got any hands, but I'm hoping. Otherwise, everyone is very happy with what they've been told this morning.
Okay, these things will percolate, and people need to think about them. That's absolutely fine. That's what we expect. I'm conscious of time, so that's probably helpful for us anyway. So I'm going to dive back into the presentation then, and just with a little word of explanation. So the next bit is from our colleague Ian Smart, who's our Assistant Director for Transformation, and just a couple of slides on this, and it's because it's mainly internally focused, if I can put it that way. But and I'm going to talk about the challenges going forward, but that's why these two things link, because over the last 6-7 years, we through the auspices of the County Council, we've developed our own internal transformation programme, and that's been a really helpful part of our senior leadership team in terms of delivering the changes and delivering the savings amongst and the service improvements that we've had to make. So I'll let Ian just talk a little bit about his service, and then I'll come on to the challenges. Okay.
Thanks, Steve. Good afternoon, members. My name is Ian Smart. I'm the Assistant Director for Transformation in Children's Services, and I've got 3 slides to cover, so nice and short and sharp and sweet, so we can get on to the challenges. The first one will be around about what we do and why we do it, and they're going to talk a bit about how we manage that work that we do around transformation, around the portfolio of work, and then just touch on the types of services that my team provide around the area of transformation across all the branches. So thanks for taking that on, Steve. Many of you will be aware that the need for transformation has been largely, and the transformation and change has been largely ever present for our most recent past. So we tend to have to transform and change, driven by a number of things. One, we have to respond obviously to changes to funding regimes and cuts in funding. We also have to respond to external assessments from bodies such as Ofsted, and thirdly, we are mainly proactive internally in terms of identifying our own needs for change, and that is we are consistently scrutinising our performance across the branches and the services, and looking at where the areas in which we need to improve further. And when I talk about improvement, we talk about improvement, that is that always has obviously the child at the centre of that. How do we improve outcomes for children? How do we do that in the most efficient and sustainable way? Because if we make a change, that change has to be sustainable to be effective. And so we are ever constantly looking at what we have to do through the lens of the better outcomes for children and how do we become more efficient and effective. At any one time, we've got about 20 programs and projects that we're managing across the department. We refer to it as a portfolio. So that's 20 programs and projects spread across the 4 branches that you've heard from more detail from my colleagues, and we report that to DMT each month. So what that means in practice is that as a DMT, we sit down each month, and from Steve's perspective, of course, that's the point at which he sees as a whole the performance of that portfolio of projects, programs and projects across all the branches, and then we tend to spend our time focusing on where we need to have points of discussion. So the PMO, as it's called, the portfolio management, sits within my business area. The portfolio management office is a mechanism. Many of you will have heard of the phrase program management office, portfolio management office. It's a function that provides us with discipline and rigor across all our programs and projects, so that we can put some structure around how we select projects, programs, how we prioritize them, and how we control them. And that is important because clearly they have to be aligned on delivering the organisation's strategy and objectives. We need to make sure they're aligned on delivering those things. We've got a lot of people in children's services, my team, Stuart's teams, Brian's team, who need to be involved in those programs and projects, and we need to use their time very efficiently. We run quite lean, is our phrase. So using our time sparingly is very important and focused. So giving that focus on the portfolio means making sure we've got the right capacity at the right place to deliver. The portfolio approach addresses really three primary questions, and that is, are we doing the right things? Are we doing the right things to deliver the strategy and the objectives? That might be better outcomes, reducing CLAR, lowering cost, within the constraints that we've set ourselves or the organisation sets ourselves. Are we delivering them efficiently, effectively? And lastly, and of course most importantly, are the benefits that we expect from it being realised? And as many of you will be aware, benefits in our world are mostly focused obviously about improving outcomes for children. A lot of those are medium to long term challenges and programs and projects. Sometimes there are some short term benefits to be had, and of course we take them. But we take a long term strategic view about improving outcomes for children, because they take time and thought. Thanks, Steve. And lastly, my last slide. So what do we do in practice? And apologies for some of the language here. Obviously, it's the language we use in transformation. I'll try to make it as simple as possible. But as Steve said, my branch is relatively small. We are a support and enabling function to Brian, to Stuart, Suzanne, and Pete. So I'm often behind the scenes and not visible, but my team are to my colleagues, and they are effective in what they do. So feasibility studies typically at the start of a process of change ask the question, is a change possible? Is it feasible to do this change? And that's a very high level piece of work, but that often gives Steve and DMT colleagues the ability to say, yes, we'll go ahead with that bit of work, or no, we shouldn't go ahead with that bit of work. And that might then lead to a business case. And business cases, you'll be familiar with the phrase, can be structured increasing levels of detail, but in effect, it does what it says on the tin. Is making the case for change, and that is, if we invest in this change, we expect to get these benefits out of the end of it, and do those two things add up? Can we make the case for change? And I say that those can be increasing levels of detail depending on the size of the scale of the change involved. Thirdly, operating model service design. You know what you see in children's services, homeschool transport, social care, children and families. They are structured, organised, people, process, technology in a way, configured in a way, designed in a way to get the best outcome, to be the most efficient they can be. That is what we refer to as operating model and service design and development. And that is often an ongoing process, because as a department we are we constantly look at ourselves about how we're organised and how can we improve. So our operating models are something that come under constant scrutiny, as you would, I think, hope. Within that, you've got the more granular service and process improvements, and we use techniques which are quite common in this area, things like lean, that is more granularity. How we work, how can we remove unnecessary steps in a process that make it more quicker? We can respond to service users quicker, and use less time, and use the time we do free up to be more effective. So for instance, one of the big programs we're running at the moment, which is to introduce a new social care system, case management system, is looking a lot at our processes, our workflows, and we're automating, semi-automating steps in the process using digital forms that in effect gives Stuart and his social workers more time to work with families, less time filling in forms. And then, of course, the program project management, which is pretty universal across all the work we do. That's our core approach. Benefits management, and lastly but not least, because I take seriously that part of my role and my team's role is to help Stuart, Pete, Brian, and Suzanne build capacity in their teams, so they're not solely dependent on me and my team. We build and coach and train the teams across the branches. So my colleagues, I hope, would support the idea over the last 3 to 5 years. What they've seen in their teams is increased capability around program and project management. They are all better at understanding process and process improvement, and that has been very effective. So that's a constant. And in short, those are my 3 slides. Back to you, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to round us off now. You'll be pleased to know, members, just a couple of key challenges as we go forward. So no surprises really that the next challenge that will be on the horizon is around ensuring that we can deliver the savings programme as we go ahead. We're confident in those outlines at the moment. But there's lots more work to do in the next 6 to 12 months to firm up those plans and ensure that we've got everything in place to deliver what we need to. There's also a lot of unknowns in this territory around things like the spending review that will come out in November, and what we anticipate from that as well. And to be clear, I anticipate that within that spending review, there should be more funding for children's social care. So I'd be very surprised if there wasn't in some way, shape or form. The partnership is also critical to us. We've got to keep working at it. I spend a lot of my life trying to hold up, secure, challenge, support that partnership around police, health and schools. Interestingly, all of those agencies, apart from the local authority, received additional funding in the last couple of years. So there's more funding for police, a lot more police officers, more funding for the health. There's been around specifically COVID, but lots of historic funding issues have been written off, and there's been more funding for schools. So, perhaps we'll be next in the queue. I doubt it somehow, but anyway. There is a recruitment and retention problem in the area for public sector. It's not just us. But it reflects recruitment of teachers and social workers, and we have to keep trying really, really hard about recruiting people. And that's been made more difficult through the pandemic. But we need to get back to retrying our innovative recruitment techniques, which were paying off before we got into the pandemic. People just aren't moving jobs at the moment, but hopefully that will free up. There has been, and we've alluded to it earlier, there's been what I would describe as a national malfunction in the SEN policy, special educational needs policy, and there is nationally about a £1 billion, that's billion, overspend, and it's not delivering on parental wants either. The policy has been pretty, the national policy has been pretty disastrous. I think I'm happy to stand behind that statement. So we'll see some of the impact of that locally, and we're going to talk about that in future sessions. School place planning can be tricky within the strictures that new schools must be free schools or academies. It's quite difficult to find good academy sponsors. So we know that's an ongoing issue for us. We've got some concerns around academy performance, though Brian talked about how we work really closely with the regional schools commissioners. But when an academy fails, it's very, very difficult to find a replacement academy chain. And I think that issue, in my view, is going to be exacerbated, and ensuring that schools continue to improve standards, especially for vulnerable pupils, again, as Brian alluded to, and that's going to be a real challenge for us as we go forward. I'm not trying to pull any punches here. This is where I see some of the focus in the next few years. Talked about our demand for education, health and care plans growing significantly and placing additional demands on special schools and NHS. Our electively home educated pupil numbers are continuing to grow, and that's a national trend, but they've now doubled. There is a gap in the legislation with regards to these children. There are significant risks around that which cannot be effectively monitored under our current regs. So that's an interesting one. I think that will change, but there's a lot more to happen on that, I think. Another key challenge for us as we go forward will be county lines, the criminal exploitation of children and young people mainly around drugs, but also around sexual exploitation. That we've had presentations on this in the past in select committee, and again, happy to do that for future select committees. We work really, really closely with the police on this. We manage this as well as we can, but it is a really tricky national issue, which we are absolutely not immune from. And then the final thing is that the old Howard Macmillan thing about what's the most difficult thing you have to deal with is it's the events, dear boy, was the answer. And of course, and you never quite know what's going to happen. I couldn't have predicted this time last year that a bus driver was going to crash his bus into a low bridge in Winchester, and but he did, and that harmed children. And so responding to those sorts of things we always have to have the capacity to respond to events. So that's it from me and all my colleagues. I'm sorry if we've gone over time. We've had to we pushed through as quickly as we could. I'm conscious we've got another presentation on the Holiday Activities Fund just about to happen, but I'm very happy to take any questions on that final section.
Thank you very much, Steve. I don't actually have any hands, but if any member wish to make any points with Steve before we move on, unmute and do so now. Or we've got Councillor Pratt-Baines, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you very much, Steve. That's been really helpful. And just going back to the point towards the end that you mentioned about homeschooling, and that being on the increase, obviously post-pandemic, do you forecast that rising even further, and how do we sort of go about that?
It's a really tricky one because it's actually significantly increased during the pandemic. One hopes that that's a peak and that more families will start to want for their children to return to school, but I simply don't know. We hope and expect that to be the case because the number of families have felt vulnerable as families whilst their children were at school, and so they've withdrawn them from school. Whether they've got an appetite for homeschooling or frankly whether they've got fed up with homeschooling, I simply don't know. We're going to have to see. That's the best answer I can give you just at this point, but we are more than happy to bring that issue back to select committee in due course once we've got a feel for it.
Thank you, Steve. And rough sort of numbers, how many students are we talking about?
It's a good sized secondary school's worth, if I can put it that way. So Brian, you've probably got the numbers more to hand than I have. I've got.
It's about 2,100, 2,200 at the moment, but there's a chunk of those about to come off because the year 11s, of course, disappear at the end of the academic year.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Wayne Irish, please.
Thank you, Chair. Do we have a process in hand to monitor the quality of homeschooling?
Do you want to come in, Brian?
What a great question. The issue is the government say that if a child is electively home educating, then parents take complete and utter responsibility for that education, and it's akin to private education. EHE actually sits in the private education wing of the DfE. So they say parents should provide a suitable education. What they don't do is to define suitable. So it's a really interesting question you're asking because the legislation is really weak around that area. It's an area we're really pushing for change. We would like suitability to be defined. What we can do is we know when something is complete and utter rubbish and therefore is not suitable, and we do take action in those cases, but it's difficult without a definition.
Thank you, Brian. Very helpful. Thank you.
Certainly something coming up on the work programme later in the term. We'll be looking at elective home education. It's something that's of interest, I think, to lots of members. Councillor Bill Withers, please.
We understand that there is quite an increase in mental health problems in school children, and obviously there's going to be a greater need, when this pandemic ends. Do you have any proactive plans on the shelf to assist in helping schools?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing I'd say is that we've got a need now. We've seen a very significant increase in quite serious mental health problems, which we can pick up through our colleagues in CAMS. And we had actually scheduled initially a presentation or a session with CAMS today, but that's moved back to September. So you'll get a much bigger input, a much more comprehensive set of information from colleagues in the NHS in September. We are doing through government grant. We have got some activity teed up in place and teed up with a number of areas. And again, I'll just ask Brian, because I can't remember the exact schools which we're in at. But Brian, can you just pick up on that for me?
Yeah, we've been given a grant by government for well-being, which was given for us to deliver a set of slides that the government gave us. So all head teachers and teachers that are responsible for mental health have attended those seminars, which give lots of information around the kind of things that schools can be doing. We also use that information, those sessions, to signpost schools to all the local systems as well. We've got 2 new mental health teams that have been set up in Gosport and Fareham. Health are funding an additional team in the Rushmore area, I think, from next January, and have got plans for a further number of teams going around the county. There's also things like the Couth app that the NHS have just launched for teenagers. Many teenagers say they don't actually want to talk to a person about their mental health needs. They'd rather do something online or through an app. So the NHS are responding to that as well. So there's a variety of support in place, but as Steve says, some of the need for that support's quite acute and needs to be done now.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't have any other hands. So thank you very much, Steve, and to your team. We will move on to the DfE Holiday Activities and Food Programme, and we'll be going back to Suzanne Smith.
Thanks, Councillor North. Right, I've got to do the challenging bit of sharing my own slides, so bear with me and fingers crossed for no technical disasters. Can I check? Can you see those slides?
We can.
Yes.
We can. Are you able to go? Yeah, lovely.
Yeah. Okay. Lovely. So in the interest of time, and you've had the slides, I'll go through this at quite a pace, but be more than happy to pick up any questions that you have at the end. So the Holiday Activities and Food Programme, HAF as we call it, is funding that's been given to local authorities by the Department for Education, and the aim of the funding is to provide holiday activity schemes for free school meal eligible children over the school holidays this calendar year. So there are prescribed criteria in the grant. We must provide 1 week of provision at Easter, 4 weeks in the summer, and a week at Christmas. And each session must include a meal, but also last for a minimum of 4 hours. Now, when we first got the funding through, we had the data we had indicated we had over 26,000 free school meal eligible children in Hampshire. That is increasing. There are several thousand more that we are planning for now. Obviously, not all children will attend this type of provision, so our aim is to provide spaces for between 8,000 and 13,000 children in each of those school holiday periods. So obviously Easter's been and gone, so I'll just do a quick kind of retrospective, if you like. I'll just cover the programme aims. Again, these are set out by DfE. It's wider than just the holiday activity. The aim to give some nutritional food is obviously to support those families who might be struggling, but there's also some wider aims around signposting and working with other agencies to connect these families and decrease kind of social isolation, and also to work with these children to help them with their wider educational attainment. So in terms of Easter, most local authorities that we know of, and certainly those on our borders, chose to offer a virtual HAF delivery over Easter because of where we were at with COVID. Within Hampshire, we did offer face-to-face delivery, and given the timeframes that we had to mobilise and put in place provision, it was only just more than a month between the funding being announced and us having to launch activities. I felt we did pretty well in terms of ensuring that where we have more free school meal eligible children, we were able to put provision in place. And we used Easter almost as a pilot for the summer to learn what works, what doesn't, which providers are bidding, and you know, to kind of shape our summer offer to make sure that the 4 weeks in summer really had as much impact as possible. We had 3 different types of grant in Easter over Easter that providers could bid into. So if you were an existing holiday provider and you wanted to add more spaces, there was a grant type A. If you were a provider that didn't currently operate in Hampshire but did in other areas, you could apply for grant type B. And grant type C, which was creating and connecting, was aiming more towards both teenage provision but also projects that worked within the wider community or were a bit more innovative. 51 grant awards were made, and we commissioned 6,330 places. 89% of the places were booked and 82% were attended, which, again, given the timeframes where we were at with COVID at the time, we were really pleased with that level of attendance. But what did we learn from Easter? We learned that our smaller providers who had closer relationships with schools were much more successful in achieving high uptake of places than the national providers who kind of entered into Hampshire and perhaps didn't have the level of engagement with schools that really meant that they were able to target the free school meal children and make them aware of the provision that was in place. We felt that some of our providers needed additional support around some of the wider aims of the programme, particularly in relation to embedding nutritional education in their offer and also signposting out to other providers. And so we've really honed in on those areas as part for in our summer planning. And we also knew that there would be some gaps in provision. And so we learnt during Easter where those gaps were, and we actively targeted in our summer programme how to try and grow provision in those areas. So for summer, which obviously is imminent, on the 8th of June, Councillor Chad approved 108 grant awards, totalling over £2 million. We, having tried the 3 different types of grants, we actually honed down to 2 for the summer. So we had kind of the holiday activity provision, the more kind of traditional provision, but with those wider aims. And we've commissioned 94 projects from 40 organisations against that type of grant. And then our grant type B, again, that was the kind of teenagers, family-based events and different, giving providers an opportunity to demonstrate kind of innovation and creativity against the grant criteria was our type B applications. And we've commissioned 45 projects. Oh, my slides have disappeared. 45 projects for that type of grant. Can you still see my slides?
Yes.
I can, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. If it's okay with you, I will just quickly stop sharing and reshare because I. Okay, can I double check? Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Lovely. Apologies about that. I don't know what happened there. We're hitting our targets for summer in terms of the number of places we wanted to make available for free school meal children, and also we're doing some work with schools who've told us that they are bidding for or they've applied to DFE for summer catch-up money. So members may be aware that Department for Education have also made available funding directly to schools upon application for summer catch-up, and it has some really similar aims and objectives around providing a meal and providing kind kind of fun activities. So where there is overlap, particularly where schools are hosting HAF provision and they've also applied for summer catch-up funding, we're working with those schools to try and dovetail that provision for those young people who are attending. And in your presentation, there's a link through to the exec member report that lists all those individual grant awards by district. So if you wanted to know which provision was in your particular area, you can access it that way. All of the summer provision has also been loaded onto the FISH website, which I spoke about earlier. So again, in terms of signposting schools or constituents, that's a good source of information. You've got a map in your pack which sets out again showing where the free school meal children are and the types of grants that we've awarded and the number of places being offered, and that's just again for your information in terms of understanding for your particular district. I spoke earlier about one of the pieces of learning from Easter was around improving the partner and signposting offer. So on the left, I have listed the different agencies and partners that we are actively working with around building that offer. And we're doing a number of different things. At the most basic level, it might be providing materials to families who are attending. So Brian mentioned the QTH app a minute ago, recently launched by the CCGs. We'll be providing families accessing the HAF provision with details of the QTH app and how they can use it. We'll also be linking in with the library service around the summer reading challenge, but we're also working more closely with some partners around kind of direct provision. So we've got the Book Trust working directly with some providers to look at how we can support families with kind of reading and literacy. And we're also working with colleagues in public health around how we might be able to dovetail some of the universal services that they offer with the HAF provision. So still a work in progress there, but lots of great work and improvement on the partner and signposting offer. And just the other thing that we wanted to improve was the nutritional educational provision. And we also learnt from the provider applications for grants that there are some areas that we felt we could support them with more. So we've got an extensive provider training and induction programme, bit of a snapshot of some of the things that are already scheduled. Each of these sessions we run on multiple dates. We run them during the day and we also run them in the evening so that we can make sure that the providers are really up to speed with all the information and resources that we can make available to provide the best services possible. And then finally, over the summer, we will be doing some extensive monitoring of the providers that we've grant funded. So we'll be asking them to undertake their own self-assessment. We'll be capturing daily attendance so that we can try and maximise and move quickly to ensure that all spaces that we've commissioned are used. But we'll also be going out and visiting provision, asking parents and young people and children for their feedback. And we'll pull that together at the end of the programme into some kind of final analysis that we have to provide both to the DFE, but we're also on the forward plan for this committee to come back and talk to you about the both the experience but also the impact, most importantly, of that funding and how we've been able to use it and what we'll learn and put in place for Christmas. So that just leaves me to say any questions. Hope that wasn't too quick and worked for people.
Thank you, Suzanne. Got Councillor Jackie Branson first, please.
Thank you, Chairman. My only concern is this is for free school meals, and there's quite a lot of children who are disadvantaged, vulnerable, who aren't in receipt of free school meals, and I know that can be a problem. You know, especially if they've got best friends. You know, if you've got two best friends, one's got free school meals and the other isn't. So, you know, is there some facility for allowing for those? And also, how does the school get funded, or whoever the provider is, if the person who is booked but doesn't attend? I think there was some concern that they wouldn't get paid, and I don't know if that's been worked out. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Branson. So in response to your first question, most of the providers that we have commissioned also offer paid for places for non-free school eligible children. So I will double check. I think in the exec member report, we actually provide details of the number of paid for places as well as the number of kind of free places for eligible children. If it's not in the exec member report, I definitely have it, and I'd be more than happy to share, because that was one of the pieces of learning from Easter. A number of these providers already offer these services. It's simply that there's now new funding to encourage that uptake, and the meal component is particularly new. In response to your second question, it's a slightly tricky one in that we have grant criteria from the Department for Education that we get paid mostly in arrears. So our own payment, if you like, is at risk. Now, what we are doing is collecting that attendance data for summer daily. So we will be able to tell. There will be a little bit of, natural. Some children just won't attend, and small amounts of that is fine and understandable. But where we see that there are patterns of non-attendance, or that there's consistently high levels of booking but lower attendance, capturing daily attendance will allow us to take very rapid action around that and work directly with the providers and with settings to make sure that we can adjust that very quickly.
I just wondered, does it work, if it's a lovely day, do they all go down to the beach and don't attend? And that can be a problem, I believe.
Yeah. And I think if it's low levels of change, I think that's kind of understandable, isn't it? I think what we want to avoid is having commissioned lots of spaces that aren't used. But the Easter experience bodes well in that respect, because that was still during kind of the height of the pandemic, and yet people did still attend, and those attendance levels were very high.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Jackie Porter.
I realise that the rules are changing on the 19th of July and possibly even earlier or later. I don't know for schools where we are quite now, but does COVID isolation feature in the planning for these services, and how does it work for that?
So in every grant application, we had to have a full COVID plan, and that included not only the risk assessment, but also what they would do in the event of having to, children having to be isolated who would be attending, or I think it even went so far as, if we were in another lockdown because of the timing at the point we applied. So we know for each provider how we can adjust provision. Obviously, it won't be quite the same if children are isolating, but they will get their meals. So all arrangements are in place that, if there's a particular group cannot attend for COVID related reasons, they will still get their meal, and in most cases they'll get some kind of online or virtual delivery in place. We are running COVID training, if you like, alongside public health for all those providers. I imagine as of yesterday, they're doing some last minute refinement of those slides to take account of the latest guidance, but we do have that actively in hand.
Okay, and I noticed that in your partnerships, the one that isn't there are the food partnerships. Most of the districts have a food partnership, which ties up not just the pantries and the food banks, but other providers and people that are interested in that as well. Do you have links to those that just wasn't on the list?
Not consistently. We do have links into the districts, and we did hold, it was a couple of months ago now, we held a really large partner briefing about HAF. And certainly food partnerships came up where they seemed particularly vocal. So the New Forest would be a good example, where they had some really creative ideas about how they were going to link together and join into the HAF provision. So it's not consistent, but in places it is in place.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. We don't have any further questions, so thank you very much for that, and we look forward to hearing about how the summer provision goes later on this year. Our last couple of items for our new members are just things that we have on our agenda regularly. The Item 6 is our update on autism services commissioning for children and young people in Hampshire. It's a written update only. You will have received it in your agendas, and we've had these since the committee requested them following an update from the CCGs on their provision. Any questions can be sent through to myself or to Jackie, and they will be sent over to Matt Powell at the CCGs, and he can respond in writing. But it's to keep us in the loop, so to speak, with those with what's going on there. So I don't intend to take any questions on this, but do let me know by email if there's anything you'd like to follow up on. And then finally, the work programme. As this is an informal briefing, we don't need to take a vote on anything on there, but it's just useful for everyone to be able to see what's coming up on the work programme, and if there is any suggestions for topics or things you'd like included, then please do let me know. Happy to take suggestions at any time by email, or indeed at a meeting if you feel that there's something you'd like to see added on. But other than that, everyone's nodding, but I can't see any hands, so I'm thinking that that's perfect time to draw the meeting to a close and say thank you very much to Steve and his team for their comprehensive briefings today.
Thanks you very much.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.